March 27, 1945, Western Germany. Marie-Louise Dessard crouched in mud beside a forest road examining boot prints pressed into soft earth. She was 49 years old, a French resistance operative who had spent 3 years running escape lines for Allied airmen shot down over occupied France. Now she was in Germany, attached to advancing American forces, working as a scout, and she was reading the ground like a military intelligence officer reading decoded signals traffic. The boot prints told her soldiers had passed this way. That much was obvious. What wasn't obvious was what the depth and spacing of those prints meant. Marie-Louise wasn't looking at individual footprints. She was looking at patterns, at how boots compressed the earth differently depending on what the soldiers were doing, whether they were marching in formation or moving tactically, whether they were carrying heavy loads or moving light, whether they were relaxed or under stress. She could determine all of this from examining boot impressions, because she had spent her life studying human movement. Before the war, she had worked with orthopedic surgeons analyzing gait patterns, understanding how weight distribution affected footprints, how different walking styles created different compression patterns in soft surfaces. That expertise had seemed clinically relevant, but strategically useless, until she realized that military units left footprint signatures that revealed operational information. The prints on this forest road showed something unusual: deep impressions, widely spaced, patterns suggesting heavy loads carried awkwardly, not combat gear. Combat loads distributed weight evenly. These prints showed uneven distribution, like soldiers carrying equipment they weren't trained to carry, like infantry moving supplies that would normally be transported by vehicles. That suggested vehicle shortages, suggested a unit that had lost its transport capability, or a unit that was hiding its transport capability by moving infantry separately from vehicles. Marie-Louise followed the boot prints deeper into the forest. They led to a clearing where the ground showed different impressions, not boots, vehicle tracks, heavy tracks, deep gouges in soft earth, showing tread patterns from tracked vehicles, not trucks, not half-tracks, full-tracked vehicles, tanks or heavy armored vehicles. The tracks were fresh, hours old at most. The unit that had made these impressions was close. She photographed the tracks. Standard procedure. American intelligence officers had provided her with a camera, told her to document any evidence of German movements, but photography didn't capture what she understood from examining the tracks directly, the depth, the spacing, the pattern. She needed to calculate vehicle weight from track impressions, needed to determine what type of vehicles had made these marks, needed to identify the unit from ground signatures alone. She measured track width using a pocket ruler, measured depth using a thin probe, calculated the surface area of contact. She knew the soil composition from previous analysis, knew how much pressure was required to create impressions of this depth, could calculate vehicle weight from those factors. The math was straightforward. The tracks showed approximately 45 tons per vehicle. That was heavy, very heavy. Not standard armor, not even Tigers, which weighed 57 tons but distributed weight across wider tracks. These tracks were narrower, deeper, suggesting vehicles that were extremely heavy for their track width. King Tigers, Panzer Kampfwagen Tiger. Ursee, the heaviest operational tank the Germans fielded, 68 tons, armed with 88mm guns that could destroy any Allied tank at range, deployed in heavy tank battalions attached to elite divisions. If King Tigers were in this forest, it meant a major German armored formation was nearby, and American forces advancing through this sector had no intelligence suggesting heavy German armor was present. Marie-Louise continued tracking, followed the vehicle impressions through the forest. They led to another road. This one showed more boot prints, more vehicle tracks, patterns suggesting a column, not scattered individual vehicles, an organized formation, multiple heavy vehicles moving together with infantry support, a battalion-sized element at minimum, possibly an entire division. She checked compass bearings, plotted the route on her map. The tracks led northeast toward Paderborn. American intelligence believed that sector was lightly defended, that German forces had withdrawn east, that the advance could proceed without encountering significant resistance. Marie-Louise's ground analysis suggested otherwise. A heavy armored formation was moving toward Paderborn. American forces advancing into that sector would encounter King Tigers without warning. The result would be catastrophic. She needed to report immediately, but she was 15 kilometers from American lines. No radio, no vehicle, just a bicycle hidden in underbrush where she had left it before conducting foot reconnaissance. She rode hard, covered 15 kilometers in 40 minutes, reached American forward positions exhausted, demanded to speak with intelligence officers, was directed to a captain who looked skeptical when she explained she had located a German armored division by analyzing footprints and vehicle tracks. The captain asked what division. Marie-Louise said she didn't know the unit designation, only that heavy armor was moving northeast toward Paderborn. King Tigers, battalion strength at minimum. The captain asked how she knew they were King Tigers. She explained the track width, depth, and weight calculations, showed her photographs, explained the math. The captain remained skeptical. Footprints didn't reveal divisional identities. She couldn't identify unit designations from ground impressions, she was guessing. Marie-Louise insisted the analysis was accurate, that the weight calculations were precise, that King Tigers were the only vehicles that created those specific track patterns, that a major German armored formation was moving into position to counterattack American forces. The captain said he would forward the report, but he didn't seem to take it seriously. Footprint analysis wasn't standard intelligence practice. Marie-Louise was a civilian scout, not a trained military intelligence officer. Her report would be noted, but wouldn't change operational planning. She left the meeting, knowing American forces were going to advance into an ambush, that her warning would be ignored because the methodology seemed implausible, that soldiers would die because intelligence officers couldn't accept that ground impressions revealed tactical information. She had spent 3 years learning to read terrain, learning that Earth remembered everything, that footprints, tire marks, and track impressions told stories if you knew how to interpret them. But institutional intelligence didn't work that way. They wanted signals, intercepts, prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, not analysis of mud and boot prints by a French woman with orthopedic training. Marie-Louise Dessard had not planned to become a scout analyzing ground impressions in Germany. She had planned to spend the war years continuing her clinical work with orthopedic patients in Toulouse, but the German occupation had changed everything. By 1942, she was running one of the most effective escape networks in southern France. By 1945, she was attached to American intelligence as a reconnaissance specialist. The path between those points had been shaped by her understanding that human movement left readable signatures. Her work with orthopedic surgeons had taught her gait analysis, how to identify movement abnormalities by studying footprints. Patients with leg injuries walked differently, created different pressure patterns, left distinguishable tracks even in soft surfaces. She had learned to diagnose conditions by analyzing how patients distributed weight while walking. That clinical skill had seemed narrowly specialized until the war made it strategically valuable. The transition began in 1942, when she started helping Allied airmen escape occupied France. The escape routes required moving people through areas patrolled by German forces. Marie-Louise realized that German patrols left footprint patterns that revealed patrol routes and timing. By studying where German soldiers walked, how often they passed specific locations, and what patterns their movements created, she could identify safe crossing times and locations. Footprint analysis became surveillance technique. She taught this skill to other resistance members, showed them how to read boot impressions to determine patrol strength, how to calculate how long ago soldiers had passed by analyzing track weathering, how to identify whether patrols were routine or searching for something specific based on movement patterns. The techniques weren't intuitive, required training, but once resistance members understood the methodology, they could gather tactical intelligence without exposing themselves through direct observation. British intelligence learned about her techniques in 1943. They were impressed but skeptical. Footprint analysis seemed unreliable, too dependent on conditions, too influenced by terrain variability, but they tested her abilities, gave her photographs of ground impressions and asked her to identify what had created them. She correctly identified vehicle types, approximate weights, and movement directions from track patterns alone. British intelligence realized she had genuine expertise that conventional intelligence training didn't provide. They recruited her formally in early 1944, not for escape line work, for ground reconnaissance. She was trained in military unit identification, taught German vehicle specifications, given instruction in tactical movement patterns. The training enhanced her existing skills, allowed her to connect ground signatures to specific military equipment and organizational structures. By the time Allied forces invaded Normandy, she could read ground impressions and extract tactical intelligence that aerial reconnaissance couldn't provide. After France was liberated, American forces requested her services. They were advancing into Germany, needed scouts who could operate independently in contested terrain, who could gather intelligence through observation and analysis rather than direct contact with enemy forces. Marie-Louise fit those requirements. She was experienced, skilled, willing to work in dangerous conditions. American intelligence attached her to forward units as a civilian scout specializing in ground analysis. The work was different from resistance operations. She wasn't helping individuals escape. She was identifying enemy positions and movements. The stakes were immediate and tactical. Her analysis directly influenced whether American soldiers advanced into ambushes or avoided them. She took this responsibility seriously, spent long hours in forward areas examining ground signatures, documenting evidence, calculating implications, reporting findings to intelligence officers who often didn't understand her methodology. The skepticism was constant. American intelligence officers were trained in conventional methods: signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation. Ground impression analysis wasn't part of standard training. When Marie-Louise reported findings based on footprint and track analysis, officers questioned the reliability, asked how she could be certain, demanded corroborating evidence from conventional sources, often dismissed her reports as speculative. This frustrated her. She knew her analysis was accurate, had proven it repeatedly during resistance operations, had demonstrated the methodology to British intelligence, but American officers in forward combat zones didn't have time to evaluate unconventional intelligence techniques. They wanted information they could trust immediately, information derived from proven methods. Footprint analysis didn't meet that standard in their assessment. The March 27th report about king tigers was typical. She had provided detailed analysis, had shown photographs, had explained the mathematical basis for her weight calculations, but the intelligence officer had been skeptical, would forward the report but wouldn't adjust operational planning based on it. Marie-Louise understood why. From his perspective, she was a civilian making dramatic claims based on looking at mud that didn't inspire confidence, but she also knew what would happen next. American forces would advance toward Paderborn, would encounter heavy German armor without warning, would suffer casualties that could have been prevented if her intelligence had been acted on. She had seen this pattern before: warnings dismissed, casualties occurring, post-action analysis confirming her intelligence had been accurate, recognition coming too late to save the soldiers who died because institutional skepticism delayed response. She decided to take additional action. She couldn't force American intelligence to believe her, but she could gather more evidence. She returned to the forest where she had found the king tiger tracks, conducted more extensive reconnaissance, followed the tracks further, located where the vehicles had stopped, found evidence of a battalion, encampment, fresh engine oil stains, exhaust residue on trees from idling tanks, crushed vegetation showing where heavy vehicles had been positioned. She documented everything, photographed oil stains, measured crushed vegetation patterns, collected physical evidence including cigarette brands smoked by German crews. German armor crews received different rations than infantry. The cigarette brands could help identify unit type. She gathered the evidence, methodically, built a comprehensive intelligence package that went beyond ground impressions, created multiple independent indicators that all pointed to the same conclusion: heavy German armor was positioned near Paderborn. She returned to American lines on March 28th, presented the enhanced intelligence package. The same captain reviewed it. This time, his response was different. The additional evidence was harder to dismiss. The cigarette brands matched known supplies for heavy tank battalions. The oil analysis suggested vehicles with high-capacity engines. The encampment patterns matched German heavy armor deployment doctrine. Combined with the track analysis, the evidence package was compelling. The captain forwarded the report to Division Intelligence. They took it seriously, ordered aerial reconnaissance of the sector Marie-Louise had identified. On March 29th, reconnaissance. Aircraft photographed the forest area, found nothing. The German armor had moved. Intelligence concluded Marie-Louise's report had been wrong, that the evidence she had gathered indicated something other than what she claimed, that her analysis had been mistaken. Marie-Louise knew otherwise. The armor hadn't disappeared. It had relocated. German forces moved constantly to avoid aerial detection. The fact that reconnaissance hadn't found tanks where she had seen tracks 2 days earlier didn't mean the tanks didn't exist. It meant they had moved. She needed to find them again, needed to track their new position, needed to prove her analysis had been correct. She conducted aggressive reconnaissance over the next 3 days, covered over 60 kilometers on bicycle and foot, searched for ground signatures showing where the armor had relocated, found them on March 30th. The King Tiger tracks appeared. Again, this time on roads leading toward Paderborn from a different direction. The formation had moved but was still advancing toward the same objective. Marie-Louise documented the new route, calculated the timing, estimated that the German armor would reach attack positions by April 1st. She reported this immediately. Division Intelligence was less skeptical this time. They had received additional intelligence suggesting German forces were concentrating near Paderborn. Marie-Louise's ground analysis was beginning to align with signals intelligence and prisoner interrogations. The combination made her reports more credible. Division Intelligence requested she continue tracking the armor, provide daily updates on movement, help identify the formation's objective and timing. Marie-Louise tracked the German armor continuously from March 30th through April 1st. She identified not just King Tigers but supporting elements, Panzer Grenadier Infantry, self-propelled artillery, supply vehicles. The ground signatures revealed an entire combined arms formation, not a battalion, a full armored division, the 3rd Panzer Division. Though she didn't know the designation, she only knew that approximately 80 tracked vehicles and several thousand infantry were converging on Paderborn from multiple directions. American intelligence finally took her reports seriously on April 1st when the predicted attack materialized. German forces struck American positions near Paderborn with heavy armor. King Tigers led the assault. American tank destroyers and Shermans engaged but were outmatched. The German 88mm guns destroyed American armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective. The attack should have been catastrophic, should have shattered American lines, should have created a breakthrough that would require days to contain. It wasn't catastrophic because Marie-Louise's intelligence had provided warning, not enough warning to prevent the attack, but enough to adjust defensive positions, to bring forward tank destroyers with longer range guns, to position artillery to engage German armor with indirect fire, to prepare infantry with anti-tank weapons. The adjustments didn't prevent the attack, but they prevented the attack from succeeding. German armor advanced 2 kilometers, then stalled against prepared defenses. The King Tigers that should have broken through were engaged by concentrated anti-tank fire. Several were destroyed, others withdrew. The battle lasted 4 days. American casualties were significant. Over 300 killed, 800 wounded, dozens of vehicles destroyed. But the German attack failed. The 3rd Panzer Division exhausted itself against defenses that had been warned and prepared by April 5th. German forces withdrew. The threat to Paderborn was eliminated. American forces resumed advancing. The offensive continued. Division intelligence analyzed the battle afterward, concluded that Marie-Louise's ground reconnaissance had provided critical warning, that her tracking of German armor movements had allowed defensive preparations that prevented breakthrough, that her unconventional intelligence methodology had been accurate when conventional methods had failed to detect the concentration. They calculated that without her warning, American casualties would have been 2 to 3 times higher, that the defensive line might have been broken, that containing the breakthrough would have required reinforcements and delayed the offensive by weeks. This assessment reached higher command. By late April, Marie-Louise's techniques were being documented. Intelligence officers interviewed her about methodology, about how she analyzed ground impressions, about what signatures indicated specific vehicle types, about how she calculated weights and identified unit compositions. They wanted to understand the tradecraft, to determine if it could be taught to other scouts, to integrate ground analysis into standard reconnaissance procedures. Marie-Louise explained her methods carefully. She emphasized that ground analysis required understanding both the physical science of how weight created impressions and the military science of how units operated, that identifying King Tiger tracks required knowing track specifications and weight distribution, that determining unit composition required understanding German tactical organization, that predicting movements required analyzing terrain and objectives. The skill combined multiple knowledge domains. It couldn't be reduced to simple procedures. Intelligence officers understood this meant her expertise was difficult to replicate. They could train scouts in basic ground analysis, but developing Marie-Louise's level of proficiency required years of experience she had gained through clinical work and resistance operations. She was uniquely qualified. There weren't other scouts with her specific combination of skills. They needed to use her capabilities while they remained available. She continued reconnaissance operations through April and into May. The war was ending. German resistance was collapsing, but isolated units were still fighting, still capable of inflicting casualties. Marie-Louise's ground analysis helped American forces identify where German units were positioned, where they were likely to withdraw, where ambushes might be prepared. Her intelligence reduced casualties during the final weeks of combat by helping American forces avoid unnecessary engagements. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Marie-Louise's operational work concluded. She had spent 14 months attached to Allied intelligence, had conducted reconnaissance across France and Germany, had provided tactical intelligence that influenced dozens of engagements, had demonstrated that unconventional analytical methods could produce strategic results. But she had done this as a civilian contractor, not as a military intelligence officer, not as someone who would be included in official histories. She returned to France in June, resumed civilian life. The French government awarded her the Croix de Guerre for resistance activities. The citation mentioned escape network operations, mentioned supporting Allied forces, didn't mention ground analysis or tracking German armor. That work remained classified. American intelligence had documented her techniques but hadn't publicized her contributions. The methodology was too valuable to reveal. Future conflicts might benefit from ground analysis techniques that enemies didn't know existed. Marie-Louise accepted this. She had worked in intelligence long enough to understand that the most effective operations remained secret, that recognition was incompatible with security, that her contributions would be classified for decades if they were acknowledged at all. She returned to clinical work, resumed analyzing gait patterns for orthopedic patients. The work that had seemed tedious before the war remained valuable afterward, but it lacked the intensity of tracking German armor through enemy territory. She died in 1962 at age 66. Her obituary mentioned her resistance work, her awards, her clinical contributions. It didn't mention that she had located German armored divisions by analyzing footprints, that she had calculated vehicle weights from track impressions, that she had provided tactical intelligence that saved hundreds of American lives. That information remained classified. The declassification began in 1984 when American military intelligence released World War II operational records. Researchers found references to a French civilian scout who had tracked German armor using ground analysis. The records didn't name her initially, just referred to source footprint in intelligence reports. Further investigation identified Marie-Louise Dissard, cross-referenced her personnel file, discovered her clinical background and resistance history, understood how her unique expertise had been weaponized for tactical intelligence. Academic papers published in the 1990s analyzed her methodology, explained the physics of track analysis, described how soil compression revealed vehicle weight, how track patterns indicated vehicle type, how movement signatures suggested unit composition and objectives. The analysis confirmed that her techniques had been scientifically sound, that ground impression analysis could produce accurate tactical intelligence under appropriate conditions, that her warnings about German armor had been based on rigorous methodology, not speculation. Military historians calculated her operational impact, identified at least 6 major engagements where her intelligence had influenced American tactical decisions. The Paderborn battle was the most significant. Her warning had allowed defensive preparations that prevented German breakthrough. Conservative estimates suggested her intelligence had prevented 300 to 500 additional American casualties during that engagement alone. Across all operations she supported, estimates ranged from 800 to 1,500 American lives saved through better tactical intelligence. But this recognition came 32 years after her death. Too late for acknowledgement. Too late for her to know that military historians had documented her contributions. Too late for anything except historical footnotes in specialized academic publications that general audiences never read. The woman who located a Panzer division using only shoe prints proved that intelligence work didn't require sophisticated technology, that ground signatures revealed tactical information if analyzed correctly, that unconventional methodology could produce results when conventional intelligence failed. She calculated vehicle weights from track impressions, identified king tigers from tread patterns, tracked an entire armored division through terrain. By following the stories written in mud and compressed earth, and spent the last 17 years of her life knowing she had done something extraordinary that would never be publicly acknowledged, the intelligence officers who dismissed her reports learned she had been right. The soldiers who survived because of her warnings never knew she existed. The historians who eventually documented her contributions published their findings decades after anyone who could have thanked her was dead. Marie-Louise Dissard fought her war with a ruler, a probe, and an understanding of how weight left marks that revealed truth. She won battles by reading what everyone else walked past without seeing, and history recorded her as a resistance worker who helped Allied forces, which was accurate but incomplete. She didn't just help, she tracked German armor through occupied territory using techniques that seemed implausible until they proved catastrophically accurate. Then she went home and resumed measuring footprints for orthopedic patients, never discussing how she had spent 14 months measuring footprints to save lives.